All right, welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking about building an API with Python. What we're going to be doing in order to build this API with Python, it can be just a simple API that's going to handle GET request or the ability to read information from a database. So far in our full stack application, we've talked about how to build a user interface with HTML and CSS. Yesterday, we talked about how PostgreSQL works, how it lives inside of our machine, and how our user data is stored. And today, we're going to utilize Flask to generate a server. This Python server is going to be able to connect with our database that we connected yesterday of school and grab information regarding students. Now, let's go ahead and scroll down here a little bit. Now, here, I have my local host living. This is essentially a representation of my machine. We've talked about how live server lives in port 59141 whenever I was hosting my live site. PostgreSQL is living on port 5432. Today, we're going to create a Flask API that will live on port 8000. And that port will essentially just connect to Postgres. We'll talk about how we're going to specify that it needs to connect to Postgres and how it's going to return this list. Now, when I say this list, what I'm talking about is this data CSV. Still working with the same data of students, we're essentially going to create an API that is able to return information to a client. Now, well, what is an API, right? Because I've been saying all this API stuff. API stands for Application Performance Interface. And what it's utilized for is for clients to be able to make requests, grab information, and create content for the user. We're going to go into the creating content for the user over the next 2 days from this request. But today we're going to concentrate on just generating this response altogether. Let's take a look at an example of a popular API. So this is the Poke API. I've demonstrated this before. The Poke API is fantastic as far as getting information regarding Pokemon. And here you can see that it returns my information in JSON format. For example, if I just wanted to know everything about all Pokemon, I could just send the following request and it would show me a very simple response. What I did is I sent a GET request to this URL pattern. This URL pattern returned to me a count of all the Pokemon they have in their database. So as of right now, they have 1,320. It gave me something called pagination, which tells me, hey, this is the next set of Pokemon. If you want to take a look at them, there is no previous page in this case. And then it tells me, here are the results, all the first 20 pages. It tells me it gives me a list of 20 objects where every object has a key value pair for name and URL. So for example, if I want to take a look at Bulbasaur, I would just send the request of Pokemon/1. And that would return to me all the information regarding the Pokemon Bulbasaur. We'll go into building this process of making our program dynamic and grabbing information of one specific Pokemon later on whenever we're building our Django API. But today we're going to concentrate about grabbing all of the students from our database and being able to read all the students inside of some sort of JavaScript file. Now, what do I mean about a JavaScript file? Let's take a look at the following. Now here, I have a simple sample of what a request is going to look like. And we're going to break down this request over the next 2 days as well, as far as how it works, how we're able to make requests and grab information from an API. What I'm saying is I am sending a request to grab or fetch information from the Pokemon API. It's going to grab the information in Ditto. I'm going to grab that response and turn it into JSON format. And then I'm just going to take a look at it in JSON. All right, so the first console.log is taking a look to it through JSON format. So when I send this request, what I expect to see is an object with the following key value pairs. You also can see that I'm breaking it all down so that I can see it more cleanly. So there's my top layer key value pairs there. Now there's a lot of stuff that's nested deep inside, right? For example, if I open up cries, you can see that this is an object with two keys inside of it. If I open up game indices, well, now I have an array of objects. But what I really care about is I want to be able to see a picture. So I'm going to knock into the sprites object, and then we're going to grab this front default key. That's what I'm doing here. I grab the response from the API, enter the sprites, and then open up front default. And what I expect is to get the following URL pattern. And this URL pattern, when I send the request, should open up my Ditto image. Right? So that's essentially what an API is. Now let's go ahead and say that I send this request here. I'm going to run node client.js. Well, now when the client or when this JavaScript script is executed, you can see that I get my entire top layer there, right? It tells me, hey, here's what we're looking at. Here are the abilities, the base experience, some forms, game indices, so on. And if I scroll all the way down to the bottom, here's my console.log statement where I'm iterating through the sprites, the front default. And if I open that up, there we get Ditto. All right. Over the next 2 days, we'll be talking about how we can utilize this information to inject HTML into our HTML scripts and create content for our client. Now, does anyone have any questions about what an API is? Perfect. If no one has any questions over what an API is, let's go ahead and start talking about Flask. So Flask is something that we're going to utilize today to build a light server. Flask is good in the fact that you can quickly create servers or Python servers with little to no code. And that's going to give us the best amount of benefit today to be able to run a server with little to no code. But it is not batteries included, meaning whenever you have to worry about bigger picture things, such as how it's going to communicate with the WSGI application, or you have to think about how it's going to be handling specific middleware for clients, what models are going to look like, all of that. Hmm. You have to build it yourself or utilize external parties to talk with Flask to be able to give you a little bit of functionality that Django has already built in. So, with that said, we've already taken a look at our client JavaScript file. Let's go to take a look at our API. Now, in this API, I want to go ahead and build a function that is going to return a list of dictionaries. All right, and let's make this a little bit simple here. The list of dictionaries that I want to return is my list of students. All right, so here's my list of students. I want to build a function that doesn't take anything as a parameter, just returns this list of students. How can I do that? Okay, I will call on someone. Let's see. Let's hear it from Keegan.
Sorry, I was trying to work it on my end. So could you ask the question one more time?
Of course. Yeah, the question is, I want to build a function that will return this list of students.
Okay, then you can grab each student by key.
All right, I just want to return the entire list of students.
Oh, okay, then just make a function that is a for loop that for student in students.
All right. Maybe it's because the way I'm wording the question. So let me go ahead and take over. Thank you, Keegan. So here I'm going to make a function named get students. And what this function is going to do is it's simply going to return students. That's it. As of now, I could print get students, run into my terminal, And there you can see I get my list of students. All right. So there's my entire list of students for each independent object, all of them being printed into my terminal. Now, I'm the majority of the way there, with the exception that if I go into my client and I try to send a request from my client, I'm going to receive an error. And let me go ahead and comment this out here. Right? I get an error telling me, hey, there's nothing going on there. I can't find something to connect with. Because right now, there's no such thing as localhost port 8000. Well, localhost port 8000 exists. There's just nothing running on it. There's nothing for me to communicate with. Okay. Well, here's my Python script, and I've created a function that I wanted. But currently, it's not a Flask server yet, and it can't speak to Flask just yet. So let's start diving into that. I'm going to quickly activate my virtual environment. You all should already have yours activated. Excuse me. And then here on the Avenger Questions channel, I'll go ahead and share the commands that I'm about to utilize to install Flask. All right, you'll see the command that I'm sending here is to install Flask. Excuse me, everyone. My daughter's asking me why I'm doing this. All right, so now I just went ahead and sent the command on the Avenger Questions channel for being able to install Flask. So I'm going to quickly execute that command. I'm going to say pip install capital F Flask. All right, and for me, I already have this installed. So it's going to tell me requirements already satisfied. For you all, this is the first time you're installing it, so you'll be seeing it loading into your machine. Once I have Flask installed into my machine, then I can simply create a server. Let's go into what that looks like. Oh, go ahead, Nick.
Does that install it just into the default environment, or is it available outside of that?
It's only inside of the .default environment. Go ahead, Daniel.
I'm getting this almost like weird thing. It's basically saying like how it's going to be used, this and that, with a bunch of different commands.
That doesn't help me at all. I apologize, Daniel. We'll have to go ahead
Hold
and
on.
take a look at it right after class or in between breaks.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Of course. All right. So now, here I am. I have my students. I want to create a Flask server. First of all, I want to import from Flask, which is what I just installed. I want to install Flask. And then I want to JSONify this. Now, currently, what a problem that I'm running into is that my machine or VS Code doesn't know what version of Python I'm currently utilizing. So in my terminal, I'm going to run which Python 3. That gives me the following URL pattern. And now I'm going to go ahead and tell VS Code that this is where my Python environment or the Python version that I'm using lives. So I'll run Command Shift P. There, it already gives me the option of select Python interpreter. For you all, if you want to do this, you could do Python and then select, and it'll come up. You'll have to choose select interpreter. Once you click on that, all I'm going to do is I'm going to enter interpreter path. I'm going to paste that URL from which Python 3. And that should find Python correctly. So now let's do this again from Flask. Now you'll see that it's able to find it. Import Flask. And there you go. So now I have Flask inside of my Python script. Now just a little bit of syntax to bring up here. I see capital F and I see this highlighting in green. What does that tell me about Flask? What is this variable? Is it
It's a
just,
class.
yeah, it's a class, right? So because it's a class, I have to create an instance of the class. So I can say app is equal to the Flask, and here I'm gonna name it. I can name it whatever I want. This is just what I want to give Flask for a name. So more than likely, if I were to take a look at Flask, it would look something like this, where it would have an init method, where my initializer takes in self and name, which is a string. And then after that, it says self.name is equal to now there's probably a bunch of getters and setters in there as far as how this works. There's a lot more functionality that goes into Flask. I'm gonna hold command and click on Flask here. And here you can see that it brings up a quick description as to what the class of Flask is. I see your hand, Carlos. Give me a second. So Flask is utilizing inheritance from the app. It even gives me a quick demo on how I can create a Flask inside of my file. It talks about different version control paths, so I can take a look at it. Here we have some of their default configurations that I can interact with, and this is going to be important because I can talk to this later on. But here I know that these properties exist, such as testing, debug, propagate, a secret key. It talks about sessions, a lot of things that I can interact with that are already somewhat built in to be able to generate this server. All right, before I continue, go ahead, Carlos.
Sorry, when you were doing the Python interpreter thing, can you show that command one more time, or not the command, except like, what you typed? Because I'm trying to do the from Flask import, and I'm still getting that, it's not recognizing
Yeah,
it.
absolutely. So if the problem is coming from a recognition inside of VS Code, you which Python 3. That should take you to the Python 3 inside of your default environment. Copy that URL pattern. I'm on a Mac, so for me it's Command Shift E to open up my command palette. I select my Python interpreter, enter path, and that's where I paste the URL.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Of course. So now I have Flask. I have an instance of Flask that's able to run. Well, is that all I need to do? Let's see. I'm going to run Python API. See what that does. I'm still just getting a print statement to my function. I know I have an instance of Flask already. So what's going on here? Why isn't it running? Well, it's not running because I haven't told it to run. I haven't gave it the ability to actually run. I can say app.run. And here is where I can interact with some of those configurations that I demonstrated. For example, I want to have debug equals true. And then I want port, which is the port where I want my server to run on, to be on port 8000. Now, quick question about this debug equals true. Why would I want this to be true during development and false once it's on deployment?
So that way, as you're developing the app and the different commands, you can see what it's actually doing, the functionality behind it. And then once it's deployed, you don't want people to see like all the back end stuff that you're doing.
Right, exactly. So once it's deployed, I don't want people to actually be able to interact with my site. But during development, I would like the framework to give me whatever assistance it can to let me know, hey, you're doing something wrong here. Well, now let's go ahead and run this server here. I'm going to run Python API.py. Here it tells me, hey, I'm going to go ahead and allow that. Great. So first I get my print statement, which is what I expected. Actually, no, I don't. It looks like I get my print statement twice. So here I run the script. My original print statement is hit. Then it tells me, hey, we're serving a Flask app named app with debug mode on because I put true. This is telling me this is not a deployment server, but I can utilize it as a development server. And it tells me this server is currently running at the following address. Let's open up that address. When I open up this address, I get not found. The requested URL is not found. All right. But now I have something that's actually running. You can see here on my terminal that I received a GET request. It just returned a 404 error, but that GET request was actually processed. All right. If we go back to our image, what just happened is Google Chrome is my client. Google Chrome sent a request to port 8000, and port 8000 said, I don't have anything to respond to you with, so I'm going to return with not found. Whatever it is you're looking for, you're not going to be able to find it here. And that's how we get this 404 not found inside of our Chrome browser. Now, where does this 404 not found come from, you may ask, or this HTML template altogether? This actually comes from a built-in functionality in Flask. Flask is already accounting for the fact that we may run into some 404 errors. So as a default template that it hands out to developers so that it gets rendered as soon as the situation comes up. All right. Let me do a quick recap here. So far, what we've done is we grabbed a list of students. For that list of students, we created a function named getStudents. We then print set function output into our terminal. We saw that that worked. We then installed Flask by running pip install F Flask. We imported Flask into our Python script, created an instance of the Flask framework, and utilized it to run a Flask server where debug will be true and where the server will be accepting requests at port 8000. At this point, does anyone have any questions over what I've just covered? All right. If no one has any questions, let's go ahead and take this to the next step. Again, what we're trying to mimic is something like the Poke API. If I copy the URL pattern for the Poke API and I paste it in a new tab, what I'm going to get is some nice JSON readable data. Because Chrome sent a response, you can even put it in pretty print. Chrome sent a request to the Poke API server, which is currently running in Node.js. That server went ahead, processed the request, queried its Firebase database. That Firebase database responded with the correct data. The server formatted it and sent it back as a response to Chrome. Well, now let's try to do the same thing. Let's try to build a response. So I'm going to create a new function here that I'm just going to name home. What it's going to return is a string of an h1 tag saying hello Avenger. Nothing too crazy here. So far, these are just functions. But how do I turn them into API routes or API views? In order to turn them into views, I have to specify a route. So let me go ahead and do that. So here, views are built to receive requests and generate and return responses. And a route is, bye gorgeous, a set URL pattern that will route a request to the correct view. All right, so there's our views and our routes. So far, we have views. One that will return a simple HTML string, and the other that will return a list of dictionaries. Well, how do I turn them into actual views? Because now they're just functions. I have to connect a route to them to turn them into a view. Let's do that. I'm going to utilize the decorator, and I'm going to call app. We know that app is just the instance of Flask. Inside of this app, there is a route. And here you can see that it even returns to me, hey, for a route, this is what it's going to look like for the following URL path. All right, well, this is going to be the route for home. So let's do that. And let's do an index. I'm going to go ahead and run my Python API one more time. My Python API is now running. And currently, Google Chrome is sending requests to 127.0.0.1 at port 8000 with a closing slash. So if I go and set this request, what do we think is going to show up in the Google Chrome side?
Hello, Avenger.
Nice. So let me go ahead and send the request. And now we get an H1 tag saying hello Avenger. Right? Again, the browser sent a request to the Flask server, which is running on port 8000. And then it went into the routes. And they said, hey, at the route where there's no URL pattern that's following the index, return hello Avenger. All right. Does anyone have any questions about that?
If you didn't include the slash, would it default to it?
Yeah, let's try it out. Gonna go ahead and take away the slash. And here we can see that it doesn't even allow me to run my server. It tells me, hey, your URL role string must start with a slash. So at the very minimum, must hold a slash inside of it. All right. Well, now let's talk about the URL pattern for grabbing students. If I were to grab something from students, well, I would specify, hey, this is an app that has a route. This is going to be interacting with my API. And this is version 1 of my API. If we all did the reading last night regarding RESTful API design, we understand that this is just a standard convention whenever you're building an API. You want to explicitly specify this is an API, and it's useful for the user to know which version of the API you're currently working on. Now, when I'm naming my API URL patterns, I want to utilize nouns to specify what it is that they are interacting with. In this example, a pluralized noun for what it is that they're interacting with would be what?
Students?
Yeah, I would have students. And that would return my list of dictionaries. Again, I run the Python API. I come over to my server or my request here, and I refresh. Okay. Currently, I'm still getting hello Avenger. What am I missing here?
You need to add slash students or that whole string slash API slash v1 slash students.
Nice, because it's not going to the correct URL pattern, right? By sending it to API/v1/students, that's how my Flask application routes it to the proper view of get students. And now when I send my request, we can see students being able to populate here on my Chrome browser. All right, so recap over what we just did. We identified that I have a server that was running, but it currently had no API routes. It had no routes and it had no views to be able to respond. In order to fix that, I created 2 routes. I utilized app as a decorator and called the route. This is the route of index, which shows up to an empty URL. So this is pretty much HTTP 127.0.0.1 port 8000 slash. And excuse me, this is HTTP//. All right, so there's our original URL pattern there. Now for the second pattern, this is an actual API. So I follow the API naming conventions where I specify the API route, saying that this is version 1. And what I'm interacting with is the noun of students. And that's how we can get all of our students showing up. All right, well, let's take a look at our client script now. And I'm actually going to open up a separate terminal here. I'm opening up a separate terminal because this terminal is in charge of running that Flask server. So I can't crash it. And I need to make sure that that Flask server is running when I send this request. I'm going to send my request of Node.js for client. And now I have my students showing up. Right? JavaScript is able to send requests to my server and grab all of these objects inside of a list. One final step here. Now, this step is called JSONify. And this function, although in the surface may look kind of useless because it's really not going to change anything about our output, it is useful to utilize JSONify to ensure that what you're sending in the body of your response is actually JSON compatible. As of right now, what we're doing is we're sending a list of dictionaries. And when we send a list of dictionaries to the browser knows how to identify that list of dictionaries and turn it into JSON data. In case we were working with a primitive browser, or we're working with something that required us to be a lot more specific about what data type it is that they are receiving, we want to utilize this JSONify function to turn our list of dictionaries into an array of objects. So all JSONify does is it translates Python to JavaScript, or excuse me, to JSON. So that when it's sent over the web, it can be read by the browser or other applications. Now, I'm saying that, and I know that we saw a successful response here, and that's because Chrome has a built-in tool to be able to do this. If it receives a response with a list of dictionaries, Chrome already does it for me, so I don't have to worry about it, right? But if I were working with a primitive browser or some primitive application that requires, hey, what kind of response am I getting? Am I getting XML? Am I getting a different type of document type? I need to specify what you're getting is application on JSON. And that's what happens by utilizing the JSONify function. All right. Does anyone have any questions over how we built this version 1 of our Python server? All right, let's talk about it just one more time. A quick overall recap. We went ahead and installed Flask. We import Flask from Flask. We created an instance of the class Flask. Here we have our student, which is a list of dictionaries. We then created some routes and views where our index route responds with the function home that returns an h1 element with the string hello Avenger nested within it. We then created a separate route that follows a RESTful API convention, specifies, hey, we are working with an API, the current version of the API, and the noun that we'll be interacting with, pluralized noun that we'll be interacting with, which is students. And then our view, where our view returns a JSONified array of objects of the students. We then ran our application inside of the terminal where debug mode is on and my server is accepting requests and returning responses from port 8000. All right, Daniel.
I see that the terminal keeps updating. Is there like a set, like I guess timer where it just repings it to make sure that everything's good to go?
Yeah, it's a great question. Every single time this file saves, it's going to update my terminal. So as soon as I save, it's going to conduct a hot reload and essentially say, hey, there's new code inside of this script or inside of this application. Let's reread it and make sure we're doing the correct functionality for this app. Now, the other type of update that you may be talking about is every single time I send a request. So every single time this application is receiving a request, or excuse me, the server is receiving a request, it's going to register said request and let me know where the information is coming from. So here it tells me, hey, I received a GET request, and that happened from API v1. I received another GET request, which still happened from API v1, and it gives me a timestamp. Finally, when I sent a GET request to index, here it shows me I received a GET request to index. The response was successful. That's what that 200 stands for. We'll go into status codes later on. And it gives me a timestamp as to when this happened. Does that answer your question, Dan?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Of course. All right. Now I'm seeing all these get information. Now, we'll dive into CRUD later on, but there are different types of methods. So here we're going to call these HTTP methods. For these methods, we have such a thing as get, which is utilized to read information. We have put, which is utilized to update information. Post, which is utilized to create information. And then finally, we have delete, which of course is utilized to delete information. Currently in the application that I've created, I don't want them to be able to do anything other than send GET request. So I'm going to simply specify inside this route, add a comma, and say, hey, the method that is allowed here is only of GET. And excuse me, this is methods, not method. And I'm going to make sure that that's in both of our URL patterns here. All right, let's make sure everything still works. Send my request. Great. Come over and go to API/v1/students. Everything still responds. And if I run my script that I made in JavaScript, I still get my response from my server. All right. Any questions over what we accomplished during part 1 of our lecture? Let's hear it, Carlos.
Could you show the client JS one more time, please? Just I think
Client.js, absolutely.
Okay, all right, that's the one. Thanks.
Nick?
In the API.py, if you don't specify just get, if you were to specify some other types, does that mean people can start doing things you don't want them to do via that route?
Yeah, so if we don't specify, it's going to leave it open to all of the posts, right? Or all of the different types of routes. If somebody sends a post request trying to create new information and they don't have the correct permissions, or maybe I have a separate view that I want to be responding to that, people can interact with this view. And there's a bunch of things that they can do, like database injections. They can start messing around with our database by writing actual queries or actual code within the request itself. So in order to avoid any of that from happening, we restrict it by saying, hey, the only way you can touch this API point is by sending a GET request. All right. Any other questions? Perfect. If there aren't any other questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording here. All right, welcome back, everyone. During part 2 of our lecture today, we're going to learn how to connect our database to our server. As of now, the server that we've created is essentially just grabbing a list of dictionaries that we ourselves are creating. But that's kind of cheating, right? It's not really creating the full stack application that we want, because in the full stack application that we want our server to talk to our database and to grab information from our database. So let's start talking about this. All right, I'm going to delete this variable named students. That's going to break my students function. All right, and for now, I'm going to return something that says students, none. All right, if I go and send my request again, oh, I have to run my Python server here. Now execute it. Then I come over to try to check out my students. All I get is students null, right? Okay, perfect. Well, now the next tool that we're going to be talking about is going to be something called SQL Alchemy. And SQL Alchemy is a tool that allows Flask to speak to different databases. In this case, the database that we're going to be talking to is going to be our PostgreSQL database. So I'm going to go ahead and send this inside of the Avenger questions channel. And I'm going to also send it inside of the Avenger channel so that everybody has access to it. All right, so this is a tool that we're going to be utilizing. It's called SQL Alchemy. How do we connect it? And what is it that I need to do in order for Flask to work correctly? So it gives me a little bit of configuration here as to how it works. It even tells me how to interact with it. But let's start talking about how we can actually build this SQL Alchemy without following the documentation and break it down step by step. All right. So first things first, I'm going to go ahead and install Flask SQL Alchemy. I'm going to do this with the following command. All right. Just shared the command here on Avenger questions. I'm going to pip install Flask dash SQL Alchemy. You'll see that for me, it says requirements already satisfied. For all of you, it may take a while to install this Flask SQL Alchemy portion. Now, this is not the same thing as Flask. This is something that can work with Flask, and its entire purpose of or existence is to assist Flask talk to SQL databases. Now let's go ahead and import this information here. I'm going to go ahead and grab from Flask SQL Alchemy. What I'm going to import is SQL Alchemy. All right. So that gives me the ability to create an instance of SQL Alchemy. Then you can see that this is also a class. Now, let's take a look at this class. This class of SQL Alchemy gives me a little bit of reading here. Essentially, it tells me that it's supposed to connect to a application. It's going to read inside of the init app, and in there, it's going to find a configuration for SQL Alchemy itself. If I scroll all the way down to the bottom, we can see that the only argument that doesn't have a default value is app, right? Or actually, this has a default value as well. But app is the only thing that we need to make sure that we pass into this SQL Alchemy. And it tells me that app must be an instance of the class of Flask. All right, so knowing that, how would I create an instance of SQL Alchemy? Let's go ahead and call this our database. And I want to store inside of our database an instance of SQL Alchemy.
Just be SQL Alchemy and then just an instance of Flask, so app.
Perfect. All right. So SQL Alchemy with the instance of Flask. So now we have our app being passed in. And now we have our SQL Alchemy connected to that database portion. But there's a little bit more that we have to do here. Our security tells me, hey, if you want to initialize your database, you can do so. And then it tells me, hey, configure the extension. All right. What does that mean? It tells me in order for the database to initialize the app, we need the following configuration. inside of my app.config. So again, if we go into the instance of Flask, we know that there is a configuration dictionary, default config. So in here, it wants me to add a new key value pair. The key that it would like me to add is SQL Alchemy database URI, where the value would be where we would actually find our database. All right. Again, all I'm doing is grabbing this dictionary and adding a new key value pair. Here's how I do that. I enter app.config. So that's giving me access to that dictionary that I just showed us. And I'm going to go ahead and add this key of SQL Alchemy database URI. I'm going to set it to a value. Now, in this example, it's showing me something with SQLite. But what kind of database are we using?
Postgres.
Awesome, we're utilizing Postgres. So we have to specify that what we're utilizing is Postgres. We have to specify that Postgres is currently located or with the user, Francisco Avila. This user has no password, so I don't need to add a password. In the case you do have a password, you would add it as such. Your password would go in here. Right? But in this case, I don't. So I don't need that colon. And then finally, I'm going to specify the location. Well, the location where it's at is in localhost. And what's the database that I'm using? What's the database name? Does anyone remember from yesterday? What do we name our database?
School.
Cool.
Yeah, we named it school. All right, so in doing this, we're able to grab our configuration schema. We grab Francisco Avila. We say this is Francisco Avila localhost, and the database that I want you to find is school. So if I were to turn this into pSQL, what I'm saying is, hey, in PSQL, inside of the localhost, under the user, or excuse me, you'll find a database named school, and I want you to enter with the user of Francisco Avila. And there we can see that we entered school. Right, that's all we're writing here. It's the address for our database. One more time, we're utilizing Postgres. We specify the user, where this database lives, and what the database name is, which is school. Okay, so now we added a new key value pair in this Flask configuration here. Oh, that's for SQL Alchemy, excuse me. So now our default config also has a key. I'm gonna go ahead and comment this out. I'm sure it's not gonna do anything, but you know what? I'll put it in there. That says SQL Alchemy database URI. And I specified that the address for it is, well, I'm utilizing PostgreSQL. It lives within the user, Francisco Avila, at localhost, where the database is named school. All right. Does anyone have any questions about what this line of code here on line 5 does? Let's hear it, Aaron.
Could you show how to pass in password again for your Postgres?
Yes, absolutely. So if I have a password right after Francisco Avila, I would place a colon and then specify my password. So password, of
Sweet.
course. All right. Does it seem like there are any questions? So now there's one more thing that we have to talk about in regards to working with Python and PostgreSQL. Well, Python isn't the same thing as SQL. And we need a way to be able to translate those two, right? I need a way for my Python to be able to turn into SQL queries, and I need a way for my SQL queries to turn into Python. So I need a middleman, someone to be able to interpret information. But that's where PsychoPG comes in. PsychoPG is what allows SQL queries to turn into query sets. And query sets is something that I can go ahead and interact with utilizing Python. Thank you. All right. So now let's go ahead and add this final tool. Again, I'm going to exit my database. And I'm going to go ahead and run pip install in quotation marks psycho-eg binary. For me, it already says the requirements are already satisfied. I'm going to go ahead and share this block of code here as well in the Avenger questions. And that is going to allow me to grab information from my database. Well, let's try it before utilizing our translator first and see what it does. I actually wouldn't be able to try it without utilizing the translator first. I apologize. All right. So here in PostgreSQL in our app.config, oh, hello. We're going to go ahead and say, hey, not only am I utilizing Postgres, but I also need you to be aware. Oh, excuse me. I put Postgres instead of PostgreSQL. There you go. I also need you to be aware that what we're utilizing as an interpreter, or for somebody to be able to speak these two languages, right? I need someone to say, hey, this Python means X, Y, and Z. Just like, if I'm speaking to someone that only knows Spanish, and I'm speaking to someone who only knows English, they would need an interpreter to grab their Spanish and turn it into English. Well, I'm going to add here that what we're going to utilize is psycho-pg. And this way, when I connect to SQL Alchemy, it knows that what we're utilizing is PostgreSQL with psycho-pg as an interpreter to grab our information. All right, any questions about line 5? Okay, perfect. When I just did all this mess, and I made all this mess so I can go ahead and create my model. So let me go ahead and take a look at the students.sql. I'm going to go ahead and split it. I'm going to take a look at my API. And at this point, I'm going to conserve some real estate and open this up. All right. Now, what is a model? So a model is a class representation of the database table, which typically represents a noun. All right. So knowing that, how would I create a class that would resemble this create table for students? Anybody want to walk me through that process?
Class, create table.
Okay, so instead of, let's just say class student, okay?
Let's try to do.
You
Oh,
misspelled students, by the way.
Go ahead, Alex. Sorry.
You misspelled students.
Yes, I did. Thank you. All right. Can I get someone to continue this initializer?
You're gonna need ID, first name, last name, age, and grade.
All right, and then in here we would go into self.id is equal to ID. We'll say self.first name is equal to first name. We'll say self.last name is also equal to last name. Self.grade is equal to grade. And then finally, self.age is equal to age. All right. Now, so far, this is just regular OOP. Nothing has changed. But I am utilizing SQL Alchemy, and I'm going to be utilizing it to turn this class from just regular Python OOP and turn it into a model. I'm going to do that first utilizing inheritance. I'm going to grab from DB model. And that tells my program, hey, this is no longer a class. This is actually a database table. So database model is equal to a database table. Now, what does that change as far as our syntax? It changes quite a bit. We're actually going to get rid of line 15 altogether. We no longer need an initializer. And because I'm no longer utilizing an initializer, I can get rid of all of my selves. And so now I just have ID is equal to ID, first name is equal to first name, last name is equal to last name, age is equal to age, and grade. But a model doesn't take in attributes, right? Model doesn't take in attributes. Instead, it takes in field models, such as char, or excuse me, such as string, integer, or Boolean, right? We're specifying the types, just like we did here on the right-hand side. So let's do that. So for example, our ID, serial primary key, just go ahead and copy these. Well, we can specify this by running ID is equal to database column of database integer, right? Because what we're utilizing here is an integer value, where the primary key is equal to true. We can find this syntax inside of the documentation for database alchemy. But here what I'm saying is we're creating a column. This column is going to be of integer type, and it will have a primary key, which is equal to true. Yesterday, when we were talking about the different types of fields or columns that we can create inside of PostgreSQL, we talked about how there's big integer, there's varchar, there's char, et cetera, et cetera. Inside of SQL Alchemy, there's just pure data types, integer, string, booleans, right? So when we walk into our first name, well, a lot of the syntax is going to be the same. So we can go ahead and do this. I'm going to start with the same syntax in all of them, where I'm saying, hey, what I'm specifying here is a database column. And all of them would be of a database type. All right, I see a hand go up. Go ahead, Scotty.
Do you not have to set the serial key in the ID so it knows that's going to be like incremented?
We can, yes, we could specify that it is a serial. In this case, because this database is already created, I don't need to, because I already created it with SQL. In the case that I was utilizing my model to create it, which is not something that we're going to be covering in today, then I would add a serial argument. Does that answer your question, Scott?
Yeah.
All right, perfect. So now, ID was a database of integer. That's what the column type it is. Well, how do I specify the column? What would be the column type for line 17? And let
String?
me pass.
Oh,
Oh, yeah, go
sorry.
ahead. That did the
String.
trick though. Yeah. All right. And then how many characters are we allowing in this string?
50.
Perfect. All right. We know that last name is going to be pretty much the exact same variation. And what about age? Let me go ahead and pass this one to Jay. What database type would be here on age?
We put integer.
Perfect. We specified that this is an integer. We don't have any sort of other value into it. And for our grade, let me hear this one from Chase.
Yeah, so this one looks like we say it's a character. So would we just do string again with a
Yeah,
value of one?
perfect. String with the value of 1. That's essentially all we're doing. We're grabbing each one of these data types or each one of these columns and rewriting it in the SQL Alchemy format. Now, I just said we're not going to be utilizing this model to create a table in the class or a table inside of the database. I apologize. So what's the purpose of creating this model in the first place? Well, creating this model will allow us to actually interact with the student's table and grab information out of it. So let me quickly just comment this out here. And what I want to run is I want to grab select all from students. Now I'm going to utilize 3 separate terminals. I'm going to go into school. And in school, I'm going to go ahead and run \I for insert and insert students.sql. So there we can see that all 5 of my students are being generated. The drop table was dropped. That's the drop table if exists argument. I then created the table, and I know that I have all 5 of my students. So my database is up and running. All right, I have my database up and running. My Node.js, which is capturing my client. If I go to execute this, I currently get an error here, which is happening because my actual terminal is not running. So let me go ahead and run that. Let's run Python API. Okay, so now my server is running. So I have one port, which is running my server for Flask. I have another port, 5432, which is currently managing my database. And now my client, which in this case Node.js, is able to send requests to the students view and get students null. Awesome. So all the pieces are starting to fall together. Now let's actually wrap up. How do I interact with the students here? Well, there's a couple of ways to query a database. In this case, I'm going to say, hey, my students, which I know are going to be of type list, I'm going to grab from the database, from the data table, students, query dot all. I'm just going to simply print out students. Let me make sure my server is still up and running. All right, it crashed, so I'm going to run it one more time. And now I'm going to send my request. Well, now when I send my request, I still get null. And that's okay, because that's what I'm getting as my return type here. All right. But if I take a look at my server, where's this coming from? Dominic? If you're speaking, you're still muted. Are you pretending to have microphone issues? All right. I'm gonna go ahead and pass it on. Let's go ahead and pass it on to Daniel.
So this is pulling the information from your students.sql and then from that file that you are inserting into that specifically. So going into that database.
Okay, so just to clarify, you are right. What's happening here on line 44 is we're actually writing a SQL query where we're saying, hey, I want to select all from students. And it's running this inside of the database URI for the database of school. And the reason why we're getting those students instance is because when we created this class, that's how we decided to represent it. We can even write a repr method, and I'm pretty sure this will work. Let's try it out. That will take in self. All it's going to return is an F string. Let's go ahead and do self.id. And let's just do self.first name. We run it one more time, send our request, come back to our server, and now we get John, Jane, Bob, Emily, and Michael. Again, what we're doing is we're querying the database. We grab all of the results from the database. This is still object-oriented programming, so we were able to create a representation method, and that representation method makes them show up in our print statement where we show our ID and the first name of every student. So let me just do a quick recap here. We made sure that our database was up and running with the correct information by running this SQL script. I'm going to go ahead and pick up after we connected our database to SQL Alchemy. We created a model. This model would represent the actual database table. Later on in our view, which is just a function, we query the database to grab all of the students and we print them into our terminal. Now this print statement is triggered every time this view is triggered, meaning that I have to send a request to API v1 students in order for this view to respond and show me my print statement. All right, I see a question. Go ahead, Scotty.
If that class students is just to reflect or basically show how you're interacting with the database, why are we passing in like those restrictions, the constraints, like what it is, integer, string, if all we care about is just grabbing that specific value?
Because they have to match to one another. If they don't match to one another, meaning each independent column has to be pretty much the same as the other, it's going to throw an error telling me that there's a mismatch here, saying, hey, these two, the model and what's actually inside of your database, don't correlate. So when I go to query the database, you see how I'm accessing independent attributes here, saying, hey, first name and ID. If I try to access anything like ID or first name, SQL, or excuse me, not SQL, PsychoPG is going to tell me, I have no idea what you're talking about because I'm asking SQL for an attribute that you said exists here in the class, but SQL says it doesn't exist within the table. And that would throw an error. Does that answer your question, Scotty?
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions? Let's hear it, Carlos.
So kind of going off of that same logic then, is this just for getting information or just when we're actually writing information back into the table? Like, would it be checking to see if, like, for first name, if it's a string, no more than 50 characters? Would it be doing it through the student's model before it passes it to SQL, or does the check happen in SQL?
It would do it
Or
through
is
the
it even
student's model first. If
okay?
we're
So like
writing,
Mhm.
I apologize. Go ahead.
no. Yeah, you were answering it.
Oh, okay. If we were writing to the actual table, the requests would come into the view, and then the view would run it against the model. And then once it runs it against the model would utilize all of the constraints that we've listed here. If it meets it, then it would pass it on to SQL.
Thank
All
you.
right. Of course. Any other questions? All right, awesome. So there we go. We have our representation method. We have our students that we're able to grab from our database, but now we need to return them. Well, I wish it was as simple as just saying, okay, well, let's go ahead and return them. Why not? I'm just gonna return students, right? And we can see my server is go ahead and went ahead and refreshed. But now let's take a look at the error that comes up when I send this request. When I send this request, it tells me, hey, this is not valid JSON. It's telling me a JSON parser came in as document type. So it's telling me that an error arose from my server. And sure enough, here Flask is telling me, hey, this is not okay. Whatever it is you're trying to do, it's not working correctly. So here it tells me object of type student is not JSON serializable. Well, my student class is not JSON serializable. So now let's go ahead and create a serializer. Now we're going to go ahead and do def serializer. And here we're going to call it student serializer, where we know we're going to receive a student type. And what we're going to return will be a dictionary. Now, all we're going to do is we'll return a dictionary that will hold ID, which will be stud.id. We have our first name, which will be stud.firstname. Our last name, our age, and our grade. All right, so now I have a serializer that will essentially serialize my data coming from my database and turn it into an actual dictionary. So now in my return statement, instead of returning students, what I can return is a list for the return of student serializer for every stud in students. Let me go ahead and run my server one more time. My server is now up and running. My SQL database is good to go. I'm going to go ahead and select all from students just to make sure that I still get my 5 rows. Okay, great. And now let me go ahead and make my request through my client side. Well, now my client makes the request and I have a list of objects, excuse me, an array of objects with all of my students being displayed. All right, the serializer simply just takes in a student and returns a dictionary for every single one of them. And what we did here was a list literal to be able to iterate through every student inside of the students list, which is a query set that came back from the database to serialize every student instance and turn it into a dictionary. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at what that looks like here in Chrome. Well, before I had students as null. Now if I send my request comes back and I get all of my students from the database. Finally, let's go ahead and take a look at TLDraw here. So far, what we've done or what we've created is we've created a connection between Flask and PostgreSQL. Our server, which is currently ran in Flask, is now able to talk to our database, which currently lives in PostgreSQL. And this communication of going back and forth, saying, hey, this is the data I need, here's the data that I have, that's all happening in code right here in line 64. Excuse me. In line 64, I am asking the database to give me all of the students. So let me go ahead and delete a couple of lines here. So here I'm saying, hey, I want to select all from students. And the database is returning a query set that looks like this, where we have an instance of student object 1, an instance of student object 2, and so on. Finally, within my view, I take those student objects and I serialize it. So that's where we have the logic to create what comes back from the database and turn it into something that's JSON readable. So for example, what's the purpose of having a serializer, right? Maybe I'm storing things in the database where I have two separate fields, first name and last name. But my front-end developers tell me, hey, you know what? I don't need to know those two separate fields. Can you just give me a field named full name? What I can do here is I can change this so that what I'm returning is full name. Turn that into an F string where I would have stud.firstName and stud.lastName. Right? And that's just a simple way of serializing data. Right? I'm making sure that data that I have, I'm formalizing it, changing its shape so that it's something useful for the front-end developer. All right. So now I serialize my data utilizing the serializers. So view serializes data and returns the serialized data as a response. All right. We haven't dove into the client side yet. We've created an HTML format, but we'll go into how promises are going to be handled over the next couple of days and how we'll do JavaScript to create some HTML injection. But so far, we're able to understand the concept of a database or a server. Excuse me, we're able to understand the concept of a server receiving a request, because of said request, querying the database to grab data out of said database, formalizing the data by serializing it, and then returning it as a response. All right. At this point, does anyone have any questions over what we've been able to accomplish today, or anything regarding the full stack application process? Pretty much everything and anything that was covered today. It's here, Scotty.
If you scroll down on the API, you have query select all. Is there, I guess I could look it up, but is there a way to basically set your own default query?
Set your own default query, like create a, instead of .all, you can create your own like
Yeah, like a
dot
conditional.
Scotty and then do whatever you wanted to do, or just a conditional.
Yeah. I guess you could do a conditional on the return value students, but I was wondering if you could do it in the query itself. Because like what we learned yesterday, select name from students if, like age greater than
Yeah,
a certain value.
that's
Or
definitely
is there
something
like
that we could do.
default already pre-made ones? Or I didn't know if you could do like parentheses, quotations, and create your own conditional.
Gotcha. All right, so here we go with query the data. So here in query the data gives me a couple of different things that I can do for querying the data. SQL model, session, database engine. So this for create all. It's not giving me the queries. Let me find them. There is definitely a thing to select which ones you want to do. Let me go ahead and find the proper documentation for that. So SQL alchemy.
I guess I could look it up too. I was just wondering, like, are they predefined or are you able to create your own?
They're predefined.
Okay.
Columns that entity. So here we have all, apply. So we can accept information, we can find things that exist. Here's like a count example to be able to just grab a count. So method SQLalchemy.count, and it's the exact same one as the select.count. So if I were to do something like count. And then let me go ahead and send my request one more time. Oh, that's gonna break my code all kinds. But oh, that's right. Here's the print statement where I can get the count that there's 5 students in there. So just like there's a bunch of keywords that are already loaded inside of SQL, they're also going to be available to you through SQL Alchemy. All right. Any other questions? Awesome. We're almost to the full stack portion, everyone. Let me go ahead and stop our recording now.